When I was a teenager, I babysat for a family that lived way out in the boonies. They had a creepy house at the end of a long, isolated road surrounded by woods. I liked babysitting for this particular family, mainly because they always got takeout pizza. My mum has celiac disease, so gorging myself on store-bought pizza was a rare treat when I was growing up. I had just got my driver's license when this event happened, and the Gearys gave me permission to use their second car to drive the kids to the pond after dinner to play hide and seek. This was in late March, right after daylight savings kicked in. That meant we'd have an hour or two of daylight before we'd have to resort to playing with flashlights. As soon as the kids were done eating, they were eager to go and play. They all grabbed their coats and we headed to the car. Everyone except their oldest kid, Olive. For whatever reason, she didn't bother grabbing her coat. It didn't seem like a big deal at the time, but that decision would have heavy consequences later on in the night. The pond was on an undeveloped property just a couple of miles down the road. I parked in the nearby clearing, and we started playing a variation of hide and seek.
1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000, 4 1,000.
The location was the perfect spot to play, and we had a lot of fun. But as night approached, Olive got cold, so I gave her my coat.
9 1,000, 10 1,000. Ready or not, here I come.
Once it got full dark, we split into teams. One team would hide and the other team had 5 minutes to find them. We used flashlights to see, and more than once, the team hiding gave away their location simply by shining their flashlight while they were supposed to be hiding. We played in the dark for a couple of hours, and as we did, a low-flying fog covered the general area and gave the pond a creepy, haunted vibe. It was fun at first because it gave the flashlights a sort of lightsaber effect. Eventually, Abigail, the youngest of the Gearys, started complaining that her feet hurt. I discovered she wasn't wearing socks and had a nasty blister on one of her heels. I was more than happy to call it a night, as I was cold and bored and ready to relax on the couch and chat with my friends. So we all piled into the car and prepared to go back home. That's when I made the unfortunate discovery. I had lost the car keys. I checked my pockets, the ignition, the interior of the car, but they were nowhere to be found. I realized they must have fallen out of my pocket when we were playing hide and seek, and so we all went back outside and looked for them. We checked the common paths and all of my go-to hiding spots, but we didn't find anything, and at that point I wasn't sure what to do. Mr. and Mrs. Geary weren't due back for several more hours, and I didn't want to ask my own parents for help and admit that I'd screwed up. I knew there was a spare set in the kitchen, so I decided to make the long walk to the house and back. I instructed the kids to stay in the car and keep the doors locked until I came back, and I gave them my phone in case of an emergency and told them to watch Netflix to pass the time. Then I started walking. It was a creepy stretch of country road, woods on either side, no houses in sight. It had streetlights, which was a plus, but they were far enough apart that I would walk in and out of the darkness. It was a cold night, and I'd regretted not grabbing my coat back from Olive before I left, but I didn't want to lose any time by doubling back. Instead, I kept my body temperature up by maintaining a brisk pace and keeping my arms crossed to preserve body heat. I was about halfway to the house when I saw headlights approaching from behind. I stepped to the side of the road to stay safely out of their path, but as the car got closer, it slowed down and pulled up alongside me. I looked over and saw the driver. He was middle-aged, maybe 40, and easily double my size and weight. He looked me over from head to toe, and I knew what he was going to say before he'd even opened his mouth and asked me if I wanted a lift. I barely glanced at him and shook my head, hoping my obvious discomfort would get him to drive off. But it didn't. Instead, he asked if I was headed to the big house at the end of the road. I nodded yes and immediately regretted it, as the next question sent a chill up my spine. He pointed out that the house looked empty and asked if I was the only one home tonight. I finally spoke, and what I said wasn't well chosen. No, the Gearys are home, I told him. He saw that for exactly what it was, and immediately pointed out that I'd called them the Gearys, not Mum and Dad. I tried to hide my growing fear as he continued his assessment, stating that he'd guessed I was the babysitter, and I was the one responsible for the car full of kids parked by the pond. My heart sank. With that comment, I realized how vulnerable I was, how vulnerable we all were. Even if I'd managed to hide from this creeper, those kids were helpless back in the car. My mind raced with all the horrible possibilities, and he continued, taunting me, saying, "I'm guessing that means you plan on going back for them after getting something from the house. Maybe gas, or maybe a spare key." I reacted to the mention of a spare key. He smiled a toothy, satisfied grin and told me he thought he'd nailed it. With my pulse racing, I asked him to please just leave me alone. The man was silent for a long moment, and then he told me he'd leave me alone if I did him a favor. He held up his cell phone and said it was dead, and asked if I could double-check the address he was looking for. I told him I couldn't do that because my battery was almost dead, and I didn't want to waste it. I tried not to look at him, but from the edge of my periphery I could see him smiling. He then perfectly summed up the situation, telling me I didn't have a phone because he saw the kids using it in the abandoned car. He surmised I'd left it with them in case of an emergency, because I'm a good babysitter. And a good-looking one. Then he flat out said, I could have a lot of fun with a girl like you, whether you went along with it or not. The way the man said it was absolutely chilling. My heart was pounding. I didn't know what to do. So I decided to stop walking, hoping he would just keep driving. But he slammed on the brakes and stopped right alongside me. I slowly turned to him and we stared at each other as I debated making a run for it. And then I heard a horn honk behind me. I turned to see Olive at the wheel of the Geary's car without its headlights on. I bolted towards it, waving for Olive to slide into the passenger seat. Then I got into the car and locked the door behind me. I looked up to see the creeper getting out of his truck. Terrified, I turned on the headlights and revved the engine. He stopped and stared at us for an eerily long moment before turning around and walking back to his truck. He looked back at us one last time, a look of pure evil on his face, and then he climbed inside his truck. He drove up the road, made a U-turn, and then doubled back. I feared he was going to try and ram the car, but instead he just drove slowly past before hitting the gas and accelerating down the road and out of sight. Olive then explained what had happened, that she'd found the car keys in the pocket of the coat I had loaned her. She said a man looked into the car and freaked her out. Everyone else was asleep, and she was afraid that the man might come back, so she decided it would be okay to drive back, if she drove only using the brake pedal the way her dad sometimes let her do in parking lots. I drove us back and nothing else eventful happened. Olive stayed awake until the Gearys got home, and then we recounted to them our frightening experience. Unfortunately, neither of us thought to get his license plate number, so reporting what had happened to the police seemed like a pointless effort. I'll never know what might have happened if things had gone a little differently that night. It's possible that the guy was just messing with me, but it's also possible that I could have been one of those girls that walks out into the darkness and is never seen or heard from again.
So now, let me ask you guys. Let's say Olive didn't return with the car. What would you do in that situation? Let me know down in the comments, and go ahead and subscribe and turn on the bell for notifications. And remember, you're never alone, even when you're walking along an isolated road and you think you are.